Operation Keelhaul was the top-secret mission by the Western Allies to forcibly send at least 2 million prisoners of war and displaced persons to Stalin's henchmen between 1944 and 1947. In part 1 of this series, we heard some of the horror stories about what happened and learned why the Soviet Union wanted these people back. If you haven't seen the first video, the link is in the description. But why did the Allies do it? Why would the Allies want to help the Soviet Union? What was their motivation, and how did they come to the conclusion that this was the right thing to do? Well, we're going to try and figure that out in this video. I want to start off though pointing out that the Soviet Union actually wanted more than just its own citizens back. The British and Americans didn't hand over Poles or people from the Baltic states who were in the West, even though the Soviets wanted them to do so. Soviet attempts to reclaim as their own citizens of countries they had conquered after 1939 were never seriously considered. Both Americans and British made it clear that they would not hand over Poles or Balts to Soviet vengeance. Thousands or possibly millions of people from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Eastern Poland and Bessarabia came under the heading of disputed persons, i.e. claimed as Soviet citizens by the Soviets but not recognized as such by the Western powers. For months and even years, these people lived in fear that they too would be deported by force to the USSR, but in fact, the Allies never contemplated their return, so far as is known. The international outcry and repercussions would have been too great. That the Soviets grumbled but accepted this limitation suggests, perhaps, that they are unlikely to have contemplated drastic action had the Allies retained others whom they in fact returned. Isn't that interesting? The Allies could have said no to the Soviets, and yet they didn't. Why? As mentioned previously, most of the sources remain under lock and key, so from what we know so far, there appear to be 5 primary reasons why the Allies did what they did. The first was a practical reason. The Germans held most of the British and American prisoners of war in Eastern Europe, which makes me wonder if this was a deliberate policy by the Germans to cause problems between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. Exact figures aren't known, but there were perhaps 40,000 British and 75,000 Americans imprisoned in the East. The British and Americans were concerned that if they didn't hand over Soviet citizens to the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union wouldn't hand back the British and American prisoners that they liberated, or would start treating them badly. That was actually one of the main concerns at the Yalta Conference in 1944. We believe there will be serious delays in the release of our prisoners of war unless we reach prompt agreement on this question. And I'm not trying to justify the crime here, but this is a fair concern. If the West had refused to send the millions of Russian peoples to the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union may have kept or ill-treated the 115,000 or so Allied troops in Soviet hands. And I don't really have a solution for that problem. It's alright saying that they should have stood their ground against Stalin, but they had to consider the ramifications. How would the Soviets have treated their men? How would they have justified their non-cooperation to the wives and children back home? Oh, sorry, your husband is in a Soviet gulag because we refused to send some Soviet citizens back to the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, that is a very hard sell. So, even with the moral, ethical, or lawful considerations, this is a major problem caused by the Soviet Union for which there's no real solution for the Allies. Again, not justifying their actions, but I can certainly understand why the Allies prioritized the lives of their own citizens over those of a foreign power. The problem with this, of course, is that the British and Americans had said no to sending the Poles and the Baltic peoples back to the Soviet Union, and yet the Soviets still handed them the Western prisoners back. So this fact undermines the idea that had the West said no, that the Soviets would have kept Allied prisoners of war in their hands. Therefore, this reason is somewhat compromised. The second reason is definitely compromised. The second reason why the Allies decided to implement Operation Keelhaul was because The leadership either mistakenly believed that the vast majority of the Soviet prisoners wanted to return to the USSR, deliberately ignored the fact that many of them didn't want to return, or believed they were simply war criminals who deserved what was coming to them. The problem was that, while some of the leaders, like Anthony Eden, may have been ignorant of the fact that many of them didn't want to return at the beginning of 1944, by the time they got to the Yalta Conference in February 1945, they knew that, and even told the Soviets that, many of the prisoners had been forced to fight for or help the Germans due to their harsh treatment in German captivity. So they understood that, with the exception of the war criminals, many of them were actually innocent or had legitimate reasons for not being guilty of a crime they were forced to commit under duress. They also knew that many of them didn't want to be sent back to the Soviet Union. In July 1944, Lord Selborne wrote to Anthony Eden objecting to the idea of sending the Russian prisoners to the Soviet Union, stating that their lives were in danger. At this early stage, Eden seems to have been ignorant of the fact that many had been forced to fight for the Germans, or hadn't fought for the Germans at all. Some were children of doctors or civilians, or all of whom hadn't fought. Eden's further argument in favour of forcible repatriation was that a large proportion of the prisoners, whatever their reasons, are willing and even anxious to return to Russia. As an argument, it would appear to be irrelevant, since clearly Lord Selborne's plea was solely concerned with those who did not wish to return. However, it is instructive to glance at what lies behind the words, whatever their reasons. The reasoning behind this was that when the British interrogated a group of Russians, the Russians all stated that they wanted to return to the Soviet Union. It was then discovered that there was an NKVD agent in the camp, and that the prisoners were only saying that they wanted to return to the Soviet Union for fear that this man would betray them. So, at first, mistaken beliefs may have played a part, but by the time they got to Yalta, the Western Allies were well aware of the situation. It was clear, despite some people's beliefs, that those who had fought for Vlasov had fought to liberate Russia from the Bolsheviks, and not fought for German ideology. Vlasov and his million followers never accepted Nazi doctrine and never promised to serve Hitler's interests after the war. You think, Captain, that we sold ourselves to the Germans for a piece of bread? Tell me, why did the Soviet government forsake us? Why did it forsake millions of prisoners? We saw prisoners of all nationalities, and they were taken care of. Through the Red Cross, they received parcels and letters from home. Only the Russians received nothing. In Kassel, I saw American N-word prisoners, and they shared their cakes and chocolates with us. Then why didn't the Soviet government, which we considered our own, send us at least some plain hard tack? Hadn't we fought? Hadn't we defended the government? Hadn't we fought for our country? If Stalin refused to have anything to do with us, we didn't want to have anything to do with Stalin. It was clear that not one of Vlasov's men wanted to go back to the Soviet Union because they knew what would happen to them. And indeed, Vlasov was executed on the 2nd of August 1946, clearly indicating that they were in mortal danger. In addition, Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army only actually fought for a very short time in 1945, and even then, many of Vlasov's troops didn't fight at all. Plus, most of them surrendered to the British and Americans, which meant that, under international law, they weren't to be classed as Soviet citizens. They were captured in German uniforms, and therefore, according to the Geneva Convention of 1929, were to be treated as German prisoners of war. In fact, that's exactly what the United States told the Soviet Union in 1944, that Soviet prisoners in German uniforms would be treated as German prisoners of war in alignment with the Geneva Convention. And at first they maintained this stance in the face of numerous Soviet complaints. So all those people telling me that it wasn't against the Geneva Convention, you're incorrect. For this reason, and for others, it was against the Geneva Convention, and Julius Epstein spends half of his book explaining why that is the case. But they didn't just send soldiers back, they also sent Soviet and non-Soviet citizens and Cossacks back as well. In fact, there were more than 30,000 Cossacks who had fled Russia during the Civil War and had emigrated to Austria between 1917 and 1920. Even though these had never been citizens of the Soviet Union, they were forcibly sent to the USSR in the May and June of 1945. So this had nothing to do with Vlasov and the Russians who had helped the Germans, because many of those sent back hadn't done that. And before anyone jumps down my throat like they did last time to explain to me that the Cossacks were all guilty of crimes during the Russian Civil War, 1. Not all of them were. You must punish the individual for the crime he has committed, not his family, not his children, not his wife or girlfriend or cousin or friends, just him, the criminal. And 2, the Soviet Union was a criminal organisation itself that had and was committing horrendous crimes. Stalin had starved, enslaved and shot millions of people by this point, and numerous politicians, officers and generals were guilty of crimes too. So the idea of sending some criminals to be tried by other criminals is, at the very least, morally questionable, and I would go so far as to say it was simply wrong. If they were criminals, they should have been tried elsewhere, not in the Soviet Union. But anyway, getting back on point, while ignorance may have played a role in the early repatriation period, say 1944, certainly by the time you get to 1945, the Allies knew the circumstances and understood they were acting against the wishes of many innocent individuals, some of whom weren't even Soviet citizens, and were sending them all back to a criminal organisation. Thus, while it was a reason, unlike the first one, it's not a very good one. And neither is the third reason. The third reason why the Allies conducted Operation Keelhaul is because there were large elements within the British and American establishments which were either sympathetic to the Soviet cause, idolised the Soviet Union, were socialists themselves, or were Soviet agents. Generations of Americans have been told that only the paranoid and delusional believe that many of America's cultural and intellectual elite once sympathized with the Soviet Union, or that key departments of our government were infiltrated by communist spies. This was all, in fact, true. Soviet-controlled agents of influence in the US government during World War II helped the USSR achieve its goals in Central Europe and Asia. It is clear throughout that, were the State Department consented to deviate from a rigid application of the principles of the Geneva Convention, it was with the greatest reluctance and only as a result of extreme political pressure. The Foreign Office attitude was wholly different, and consisted largely in attempting to meet Soviet desires even before they were expressed. And it wasn't just the Americans. Stalin impressed me from the first, and my opinion of his abilities has not wavered. His personality made itself felt without effort or exaggeration. He had natural good manners, perhaps a Georgian inheritance. Though I knew the man to be without mercy, I respected the quality of his mind and even felt sympathy, which I have never been able entirely to analyse. To prove definitively that the US and UK establishments were Soviet agents or were socialists that sympathised with the Soviet Union would require an entire video series by itself, so it's not practically possible for me to do this here. Thus, I can't wait for the critics to leap on this one. But for those critics of mine that can actually read, there are books on this topic that do show that this is the case. Rammstein and Brindle's The Verona Secrets Exposing Soviet Espionage and America's Traitors shows that many of the highest authorities in the United States government were Soviet spies. Even Einstein was suspect, and Orwell wrote about the pro-Soviet bias in British intellectual circles in his absolutely fantastic essay, The Prevention of Literature, which you can find online for free, link in the description. Honestly, I think that essay should be mandatory reading by everyone living in the West right now. Parts of it read as though it was written today. But here is what Orwell said on the British intellectuals and Operation Keelhaul. There can be no question about the poisonous effect of the Russian mythos on English intellectual life. Because of it, known facts are suppressed and distorted to such an extent as to make it doubtful whether a true history of our times can ever be written. Let me give you just one instance out of the hundreds that could be cited. When Germany collapsed, it was found that very large numbers of Soviet Russians, mostly no doubt from non-political motives, had changed sides and were fighting for the Germans. Also, a small but not negligible portion of the Russian prisoners and displaced persons refused to go back to the USSR, and some of them at least were repatriated against their will. These facts, known to many journalists on the spot, went almost unmentioned in the British press, while at the same time, Russophile publicists in England continued to justify the purges and deportations of 1936 to 38 by claiming that the USSR had no quislings. The fog of lies and misinformation that surrounds such subjects as the Ukraine famine, the Spanish Civil War, Russian policy in Poland, and so forth is not due entirely to conscious dishonesty. But any writer or journalist who is fully sympathetic for the USSR, sympathetic that is, in the way the Russians themselves would want him to be, does have to acquiesce in deliberate falsification on important issues. In Western Europe and America, large sections of the literary intelligentsia have either passed through the Communist Party or have been warmly sympathetic to it. Orwell then likens Marxism to a religion or a theocracy, and this is true. After all, the original title of the Communist Manifesto was The Communist Confession of Faith, because socialism is a religion, and the people in Orwell's era were adherents to the faith. This becomes apparent when you hear what the chiefs of the so-called capitalist powers were saying at the time. The money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths. The measure of the restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values more noble than mere monetary profit. Was Mr. Roosevelt really a capitalist? I think not. The spy known as Philby, who was a communist and had had a communist wife, by the way, was recruited as a British intelligence officer and also double agent for the Soviet Union. He was busy throughout the war passing MI6 secrets to the USSR. As he himself admitted after his defection to Moscow in 1963, he considered that his most important espionage achievement during World War II was disrupting Abwehr attempts to broker a separate peace between Germany and Britain at the expense of Russia. The point here is that many in the Western establishments were either communist or socialist themselves, or were anti-capitalist, or had sympathies or allegiances with the Soviet regime. So, when it comes to standing up to Stalin, there was no backbone. In fact, they basically bent over to Stalin in much the same way that Chamberlain had bent over to Hitler during the 1930s. One of the most obvious examples is Anthony Eden, who met Stalin in Moscow on the 11th of October 1944. The Soviet leader was in superb form, exhibiting alternatively wit, humour and gentle wisdom. Eden found his old admiration for Stalin welling up once more with increased fervour. Suddenly, Stalin became grave and, glancing sideways at Eden, broached a new topic. What followed was so gratifying and exciting for Eden that his euphoria almost bubbles through the telegram he sent the next day to Sir Orme Sargent in London. At dinner last night, my conversation with Marshal Stalin turned for a moment on the Russian troops whom we had in England. The Marshal said he would be extremely grateful if any arrangements could be made to get them back here. I said we should be glad to do anything we could to help, and that I knew that those shipping difficulties were very considerable. We are now re-examining the possibility both in respect to troop ships to carry the men and the necessary escorts. The Marshal repeated that he would be deeply in our debt if we could arrange matters for him about this. I replied that he could be sure that we would do all we could to help, and in return I felt sure that his government would give all the help in their power to our prisoners in Germany as and when the Red Army reached German prison camps in which they were located. The Marshal said at once that certainly this would be done. He would make this his personal charge, and he gave me his personal word that every care and attention would be given to our men. I feel that in view of this conversation, it would be most unwise to try to bargain the transport of the Russians against the care of our prisoners, but that we should go ahead with the arrangements, and when we definitely inform the Russians of the action we are able to take, we should remind them of what Marshal Stalin has told me about Russian care of our men.
Oh, get a room. Then, to cut a long story short, because the British had already given in to the Soviets, the United States leadership dropped its former stance on the Geneva Convention. From what we currently know, it appears that they just abandoned it and didn't even attempt to justify the sudden reversal of policy. That might explain why the forced repatriation was done in secret, because the Western Allies knew it was totally and completely unlawful, as Epstein went to great lengths in his book to point out. Thus, the third reason is that the British and American leadership were at least sympathetic to the Soviet cause, if not fully in bed with them, and did everything they could to satisfy Stalin's wants and needs. Was it only because they were allies in a war against a common enemy, or was it because the religion of socialism blinded them to reality? It was definitely the latter, but this willingness to bow down to the horrors of socialism led to yet another socialist crime against humanity that has largely been forgotten and that the socialists are now scrambling to justify in the comment sections of my videos. Just wait until episode 3. The fourth reason was because the British and Americans wanted to improve relations with the Soviet Union. Some in the comments of my previous video suggested that this may have been in the hope that Stalin would back out of Poland and Eastern Europe. This might be true, but the sources I have don't suggest that, so I can't confirm it. But it was a good point, so well done to the guys who suggested it. Arguably, of course, it would be nice to have good relations with another country, so by itself, this could be a factor. But when the other country is the Soviet Union, or Nazi Germany, then you might want to reconsider. This, of course, relates back to reason number 3, which was that they were sympathetic to the Soviet regime, and therefore it was probably for that reason that they were trying to improve relations. The fifth reason was because the British establishment, and possibly the establishment of the other allies too, were trying to prevent a domestic scandal, and if they delayed the deportation of these people, people at home would find out who they were and object to their treatment. Many in the previous video expressed their shock and outrage over these events, and you can imagine what it would have done in 1945 as the crime was being committed. Unfortunately, the details of why they feared this scandal are lacking, so it's hard to make a judgment about it, but I would say that this only imposed a time limit on the problem, meaning if they didn't sort out the prisoners one way or another, then people would find out about them and then be shocked at their treatment if they were then sent back to the Soviet Union. So they had to implement Operation Keelhaul quickly before the people back home realised that many of their prisoners were actually innocent and were being sent to the Soviet Union for certain enslavement or execution. So it doesn't really justify or excuse them for deporting the prisoners to the Soviet Union. Therefore, out of the 5 reasons, the second one, the ignorance argument, doesn't hold up at all. The fifth one, to prevent a scandal, doesn't offer a solution, only a time limit. The third one, them being communist sympathizers, and the fourth one, them wanting to improve relations with the Soviet Union, explains why the leadership are guilty as charged, and it's only really the first one which gives them an out. The fact that there were Allied prisoners of war in Soviet hands meant that they had to placate the Soviets in order to get their boys home. However, this one is compromised by the fact that the Allies had refused to hand over the Poles and the Baltic peoples to the Soviet Union. So they were capable of saying no and still getting their own prisoners back. Were any of these reasons good enough to justify the Allies' participation in Operation Keelhaul? Honestly, I don't know. I'll let you be the judge on that, and I would love to hear your opinions in the comments. That said, because the sources are under lock and key, there may be other reasons that are currently not known for why the Allies did what they did, and I get the impression that this is the case. For example, in Tolstoy's book, which is a great book on the subject by the way, and far easier to get a hold of than Epstein's book, Tolstoy provides clues that suggest that something else may have been going on. Lord Selborne had objected to the idea of forcibly repatriating the Russians who didn't want to be repatriated. He complained to Anthony Eden and sent a copy of the letter to Churchill, who read it and then wrote this to Eden. I think we dealt rather summarily with this at Cabinet, and the point put by the Minister of Economic Warfare should certainly be considered. Even if we are somewhat compromised, or the apparatus of delay may be used. What did Churchill mean by the phrase somewhat compromised? The answer is, we don't know. Tolstoy explains that, at this early stage, the British had only communicated once with the Soviets over the issue, and that the USSR hadn't been told yet of the cabinet decision, which had only been made on the 17th of July 1944. Therefore, with the evidence we currently have, there's no reason to believe that the British position was somewhat compromised, or that they shouldn't have been able to make a decision on their own. The fact that Churchill believed that the British position was somewhat compromised, even though it wasn't from the available evidence, suggests that something else was going on, or had gone on, behind the scenes to compromise the British position. We don't know the answer. Maybe it was to do with the Allied prisoners of war in Soviet hands, or it could be something else entirely. But if it wasn't about the Allied prisoners of war, I have an idea of what it could be, and this is just a guess. I'm not saying it is this, it could be something else, but this sort of fits. In July 1944, the Allies had only really just landed in Normandy. The Germans were getting destroyed in Operation Bagration, and the end was nigh for Nazi Germany. But what had just happened before this point? Well, throughout 1943, the West was very concerned, especially in the August-September 1943 period, that Stalin and Hitler would make a separate peace. They believed that the Soviet Union was very weak after all the hard fighting they had suffered from so far, which was true, and so they feared that the Soviets may be seeking a peace with Germany now rather than pay a higher price for victory later. In fact, there were peace feelers between Moscow and Berlin throughout 1942 and 1943. The West, therefore, wanted to give concessions to the Soviets in order to keep them in the war, which they did at the Moscow Conference in October and the Tehran Conference in November-December of 1943. By the fall of 1943, evidence had mounted that a peace with Hitler was impossible, and his replacement by more reasonable men improbable. The Russians nevertheless abstained from endorsing the formula for unconditional surrender until after the Normandy landings in June 1944. As long as the Second Front was in abeyance, they avoided doing anything that would prejudice a separate arrangement with an anti-Nazi regime in case Hitler's enemies would come to power after all. But after September 1943, the Soviet Union no longer went as far as actively to prepare for such an arrangement. There's no evidence, as far as I'm aware, to suggest that the Soviets were seeking a separate peace in late July 1944, although there was a bomb plot going on and the Soviets may have known about that. The West certainly did. If so, maybe the Soviets were hoping that Hitler's replacement might have been more willing to make peace. In fact, That was exactly what the idea was. The plotters hoped to have set up a new government to replace Hitler and establish peace. But who were they going to have peace with? Well, initially the bulk of the plotters preferred peace with the West rather than the East. Now yes, by the time you get to the July 1944 plot, especially after D-Day, it appeared unlikely that the West would want peace now, and the plotters knew this, but they went ahead with it anyway. So, as a bit of speculation, I'm wondering if the reason Churchill described the British as being somewhat compromised in July 1944 is in relation to one of these various peace negotiations or the July 1944 bomb plot itself. Either Churchill believed that Stalin wanted to make a separate peace, and therefore the British were compromised and had to bow to the Soviets to keep them on side, or the British themselves were trying to make a separate peace at some point. Hess or July 1944 bomb plot, and this somewhat compromised their position with the Soviet Union, who therefore would have leverage over them. I don't know, and maybe it's something else entirely, but I suspect that there were more reasons behind Operation Keelhaul than the 5 main ones we know for certain right now. Again, the archives remain sealed with regards to Canaris and the peace negotiations between Germany and the Western Allies, as well as those between Germany and the Soviet Union, as well as the Hess flight. So it's not possible to dive into the details and figure out exactly what's going on. But isn't it strange how the archives remain sealed when it comes to all the separate peace negotiations between the various powers? That's a little bit coincidental, wouldn't you say? Either way, the Allies had their excuses for why they went ahead with Operation Keelhaul. In the next video, we're going to discuss some of the counter-arguments against the idea that Operation Keelhaul even happened, or if it did, why it wasn't a crime, or if it was, why my version of events is wrong, or not objective, or that every source I use in every video of mine is somehow not a real source, or how, even though I'm calling out both the Western Allies and the Soviet Union for their criminal activities, and have called out the Axis powers for their crimes in the past, I'm somehow shilling for the West or the Nazis or somebody else. And yes, some of these arguments are arguments other historians have made, others were made in lawsuits and similar. I'm also going to make some counter-arguments against the current narrative of Operation Keelhaul. Yes, even me, because I think critically when I'm reading history. And still other arguments were made by a bunch of Stalin's shills in the comment section of my previous video, and no doubt in this video too. Oh, and don't think about going back and deleting comments because I've already got the screenshots. I know others will complain that I should ignore the trolls, but some have legitimate concerns and I think it's good to discuss them. And if I'm doing that, I may as well have fun forcing idiots to rub their faces in their own feces. So I'm looking forward to next time, and I hope you are too. Thanks for watching, bye for now.